Picture this: a solitary figure wrapped in a worn cloak, trudging through muddy roads and mountain passes, their most treasured possession not gold or jewels, but a satchel filled with fragile manuscripts. These were the wandering scholars of medieval Europe, the unsung heroes who carried the light of knowledge across a fractured continent, defying borders, bandits, and the very limits of their age. While kings waged wars and castles rose and fell, these determined travelers moved silently between monasteries, courts, and fledgling universities, stitching together the intellectual fabric of an entire era. Their stories are etched not in grand monuments, but in the countless ideas they smuggled across frontiers, ideas that would shape philosophy, science, and the very way we think today. How did these lone intellectuals become the backbone of a knowledge revolution? Imagine a world without libraries, without universities, where books were rarer than precious gems. In such a landscape, knowledge didn't stay in one place. It had to travel, carried on the backs of scholars willing to brave treacherous journeys. From the snowbound passes of the Alps to the sun-baked roads of Spain, these wanderers connected distant corners of Europe and beyond, weaving a hidden web of learning that stretched from Islamic Cordoba to the cathedral schools of Paris. They were translators, teachers, and sometimes even spies for ideas, smuggling Greek philosophy, Arabic medicine, and Jewish law past the guarded gates of ignorance. This is the untold saga of how knowledge refused to be caged by borders, a story that echoes startlingly into our own time. Over the next minutes, we'll retrace their footsteps from the crumbling ruins of Rome to the first great universities, uncovering how these scholars turned the entire continent into a classroom. We'll meet fiery thinkers like Peter Abelard, whose debates lit sparks across Europe, and shadowy figures like Constantine the African, who smuggled medical secrets between worlds. You'll discover how Latin became the first internet, how a single book could take a year to copy, and why the Black Death unexpectedly freed ideas from the control of the powerful. Most importantly, you'll see how their struggle to share knowledge freely mirrors our own digital age's battles over who gets to learn and who gets left behind. So tighten your satchel and ready your mind. We're stepping onto the medieval roads where every footstep carried the weight of the future. When the Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, it wasn't just roads and aqueducts that fractured. The very flow of knowledge itself was at risk. Cities that had once buzzed with philosophers and public libraries now stood hollow, their marble halls repurposed for survival rather than study. But in the shadows of this collapse, a new kind of figure emerged: the wandering scholar. These weren't just bookish travelers, they were intellectual refugees navigating a world where stability had vanished and wisdom had become as scattered as the empire's broken statues. Take Alcuin of York, a scholar plucked from the relative safety of England's monastic schools to serve at the court of Charlemagne in the late 8th century. Here was a man who didn't just carry books, he carried entire educational systems on his back. Charlemagne, desperate to revive the glory of Rome, needed someone to rebuild Europe's gutted intellectual infrastructure. Alcuin responded by designing a curriculum that fused Christian theology with surviving fragments of Roman rhetoric and logic. His classrooms in Aachen became a blueprint for how knowledge could flourish even in uncertain times, proving that royal courts could double as vibrant centers of learning. But why travel at all? Why endure bandit-ridden roads and uncertain shelter? The answer lies in the stark reality of post-Roman Europe. With urban centers in decay and local schools shuttered, if you hungered for education, you had to chase it. Monasteries, those isolated islands of ink and parchment, became way stations for scholars willing to walk hundreds of miles for a single manuscript. Imagine a young student setting out from a crumbling villa in Gaul, drawn by rumors of a monastery in the Alps where a single volume of Cicero's speeches might survive. The journey itself was an education through hostile territories, past villages where Latin had faded into local dialects, toward the flickering candlelight of a scriptorium where monks copied texts as if each word were a lifeline. What's often overlooked is how these wanderers didn't just preserve knowledge, they remixed it. In the margins of those painstakingly copied manuscripts, you'll find notes in Old English, Irish, or even Arabic, evidence of the cultural collisions that happened when scholars from different worlds met on the road. A monk from Ireland might bring his tradition of intricate biblical commentary to a French monastery, while a Visigoth scholar fleeing political unrest in Spain could introduce fragments of Roman law forgotten elsewhere. This wasn't mere repetition, it was intellectual alchemy turning scattered fragments into something new. The blend of traditions they carried shaped everything from medieval science to governance. When Alcuin taught Charlemagne's courtiers, he wasn't just reciting dry texts, he was showing how Roman administrative techniques could strengthen a Christian kingdom, or how classical logic could clarify theological debates. The wandering scholars became living bridges between the ancient and medieval worlds, proving that mobility wasn't just a necessity, it was the very engine of intellectual rebirth. Monasteries were more than just quiet retreats for prayer. They became fortresses guarding the flickering flame of knowledge through Europe's so-called Dark Ages. Picture a scriptorium at dawn, rows of monks hunched over wooden desks, their hands moving methodically as quills scratched across parchment. Each stroke was an act of defiance against oblivion, preserving not just scripture but fragments of Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero that might otherwise have been lost forever. These cloistered rooms, often chilly and dimly lit, functioned as the medieval equivalent of server farms, where data wasn't stored in bytes but in painstakingly inked letters. A single Bible could take a monk years to copy, an entire lifetime's work might amount to just a handful of books. Yet without this meticulous labor, the intellectual heritage of antiquity would have vanished like smoke. But monasteries weren't just static repositories. They were nodes in a vast, informal network stretching from Ireland to the Levant. Consider Gerbert of Aurillac, a monk whose curiosity couldn't be contained by cloister walls. In the 10th century, he left his French monastery for Spain, where Islamic scholars in Catalonia introduced him to Arabic numerals, astrolabes, and Greek mathematics, concepts utterly foreign to most of Europe at the time. When Gerbert returned north, he didn't just bring back books. He brought revolutionary ideas that would later influence everything from cathedral schools to the scientific method. His journey reveals a truth often overlooked. Monasteries weren't just places where knowledge was stored. They were launch pads for thinkers who carried ideas across borders, blending Christian, Islamic, and classical traditions into something new. The monastic life was supposed to be one of withdrawal, yet paradoxically, it became a catalyst for connection. Monks followed strict rules of stability, pledging to remain in one community, but their manuscripts knew no such limits. A Bible copied in an English monastery might find its way to a scholar in Bavaria, its margins filled with glosses in Old English that German monks would then translate into Latin. This cross-pollination turned isolated scriptoriums into the first true intellectual marketplace of medieval Europe. Even the architecture tells the story. Cloisters designed for quiet reflection often had guest quarters for traveling scholars, their walls echoing with debates in half a dozen languages. What's easy to miss is how fragile this system was. A single Viking raid or fire could erase centuries of accumulated knowledge in an afternoon. That's why monks didn't just copy texts, they dispersed them, sending duplicates to sister monasteries across the continent like a medieval backup system. When Charlemagne ordered the standardization of liturgical books, he wasn't just imposing religious unity, he was creating a survival strategy for knowledge itself. The Benedictine motto Ora et Labora, pray and work, took on new meaning when the work involved safeguarding civilization's memory. Yet for every monk content to spend decades transcribing, there were others who chafed at the silence. These restless minds became the bridge between the cloister and the wider world. They left behind the certainty of monastic life for the unpredictable road, carrying not just books but the skills to decipher them. In doing so, they turned monasteries from endpoints into waystations, places where knowledge didn't just rest, but gathered strength before leaping into the unknown. The next time you see a medieval manuscript in a museum, remember, its survival wasn't an accident. It was the result of countless choices by scribes, travelers, and rebels who believed ideas were worth risking storms, bandits, and even heresy charges to keep alive. By the 11th century, Europe's intellectual landscape was shifting. No longer confined to remote monasteries, learning began to cluster where spires pierced the sky. Cathedral schools anchored to the grand churches of rising cities like Chartres, Paris, and Reims became the new crossroads for wandering scholars. Imagine the scene, cobbled streets thick with the chatter of students from Normandy, Germany, even distant Hungary, all drawn to these urban hubs where knowledge wasn't just preserved but debated, refined, and set ablaze. This was no accident. As towns grew wealthy from trade, bishops and wealthy patrons poured resources into education, desperate for trained clergy to manage increasingly complex societies. A priest in the year 1000 might need only basic Latin to recite Mass, but by 1100, he'd be expected to draft legal documents, advise lords, and even negotiate treaties. The age demanded minds as sharp as the cathedral vaults soaring overhead. At the heart of this transformation lay the curriculum known as the Trivium and Quadrivium, 7 liberal arts that became the medieval scholar's compass. The Trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic was the foundation, turning raw intellect into precision tools. Grammar wasn't just about conjugating verbs, it taught students to dissect texts like surgeons. Rhetoric armed them with persuasion's power, while logic, the crown jewel, enabled them to dismantle flawed arguments with merciless clarity. Then came the Quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, subjects that mapped the very order of creation. Geometry wasn't merely shapes, it was the language God used to design the cosmos, or so scholars believed. Together, these disciplines didn't just educate, they sculpted a new class of thinkers capable of rebuilding civilization from the ground up. No one embodied this fiery new spirit more than Peter Abelard, the rock-star philosopher of 12th century Paris. His lectures at the Cathedral school near Notre Dame drew crowds so large they spilled into the Seine's muddy banks. Abelard didn't just teach, he performed, using his trademark dialectical method to pit ideas against each other like gladiators in an arena. When he argued that logic could illuminate faith, or even challenge church doctrine, students flocked to him by the hundreds, some sleeping in barns or under bridges just to hear him speak. His infamous love affair with Héloïse might dominate modern retellings, but his true legacy was proving that education could be thrilling, contentious, even dangerous. What made these schools revolutionary wasn't just their curriculum but their mobility. Unlike monasteries, which demanded lifelong vows, cathedral schools were transient by design. A scholar might study logic in Paris under Abelard, then follow a rival master to Chartres for rhetoric, creating an intellectual migration that crisscrossed Europe. This fluidity bred something unprecedented, a shared identity among scholars that transcended local loyalties. When a student from England debated a peer from Italy in the shadow of Rheims Cathedral, they weren't just exchanging ideas. They were forging a pan-European conversation that would eventually birth the university system. Yet for all their structure, these schools retained the wandering spirit of earlier times. Teachers often traveled between cities, lured by better pay or freer air to debate controversial ideas. Manuscripts circulated like currency, annotated by generations of hands in margins crammed with Old French, Latin puns, and sketches of griffins. Even the architecture reflected this blend of order and movement, cloisters for quiet study, but also bustling hostels where travelers swapped news from Toledo's Arabic libraries or the latest theological scuffle in Rome. The cathedral school was both anchor and sail, tethering scholarship to place while letting it ride the winds of dissent. Beneath the soaring arches, a quiet revolution was unfolding. The Trivium's emphasis on critical thinking began seeping beyond clergy into law, medicine, and governance. Kings hired cathedral-trained scribes not just for their penmanship, but for their ability to craft airtight arguments. Towns commissioned school graduates to draft charters that would shield their hard-won liberties. This was the cathedral school's unsung triumph. It turned knowledge from a guarded treasure into a toolkit for reshaping society. And though the universities that followed would inherit this legacy, it was here, in these vibrant, quarrelsome classrooms, that Europe first relearned how to think. Latin wasn't just a language in medieval Europe. It was a passport, a secret handshake among scholars who might never meet but could converse across centuries and kingdoms. Picture two intellectuals from opposite ends of the continent, one penning a treatise in a Bavarian monastery, the other annotating it decades later in a Sicilian court. Though they spoke different mother tongues, Latin let them argue, refine, and build on each other's work as if they were seated at the same table. This was the magic of the lingua franca, a linguistic thread stitching together a patchwork of dialects from the Celtic murmurs of Ireland to the Slavic rhythms of Bohemia. Without it, the Republic of Letters would have shattered into 1,000 isolated fragments. Yet Latin's dominance created a stark divide. While scholars debated Aristotle in polished Ciceronian phrases, farmers haggling in marketplaces or minstrels singing epic tales used vernacular languages as vibrant and varied as the landscapes they sprang from. A merchant in Florence might curse in Tuscan, a poet in Provence woo in Occitan, but neither could read a legal contract or university lecture unless they'd mastered Latin. This wasn't just a language barrier, it was a class barrier separating the educated elite from everyone else. The irony, many Latin scholars grew up speaking vernaculars at home. Abelard of Bath, the 12th century polymath who trekked from England to Antioch, likely muttered Anglo-Saxon as a child before being drilled in Latin's rigid declensions. His journey mirrors the intellectual crossing all scholars had to make from the earthy cadences of childhood to the disciplined syntax of universal thought. Translation was where Latin's limits and its possibilities truly shone. When Abelard sought Arabic scientific texts in Antioch, he didn't just need linguistic skill, he needed cultural alchemy. Arabic numerals, Aristotle's lost works filtered through Syriac and Persian commentaries, medical tracts from Baghdad. All had to be painstakingly rendered into Latin without losing their essence. One mistranslated term could send generations down philosophical dead ends. Consider the Arabic al-Jabr, which Abelard and others transformed into algebra. The word carried not just a mathematical concept but an entire mode of thinking alien to Europe's arithmetic traditions. These translators weren't mere scribes, they were intellectual tightrope walkers, balancing fidelity to the original with the need to make ideas resonate in a Christian context. The real challenge wasn't just vocabulary but worldview. Greek and Arabic texts often clashed with Latin Europe's assumptions. Arabic medical works attributed disease to natural causes, not divine wrath. Greek metaphysics posed questions about the soul that Latin theologians found uncomfortable. Translators like Constantine the African, who rendered Arabic medical texts in Salerno, sometimes softened these edges, adding Christian frames to Muslim-authored texts. Other scholars, like Gerard of Cremona in Toledo, strove for razor-sharp accuracy, even if it meant leaving readers bewildered by unfamiliar concepts. The tension between adaptation and purity sparked debates that still echo in modern discussions about cultural exchange. When you translate an idea, do you domesticate it or let it stay foreign? What's often forgotten is how this linguistic unity enabled something radical: dissent. Because Latin was no one's native tongue, it became a neutral ground for controversy. A German scholar could critique an Italian's thesis without the baggage of regional rivalries coloring the words. Heretical ideas, like those of Peter Abelard, spread precisely because Latin provided a common stage for intellectual combat. The same language that bound scholars to tradition also gave them the tools to dismantle it. Yet Latin's reign wasn't absolute. Glimmers of vernacular learning peek through the margins, literally. Monks scribbling Old English glosses between Latin lines, troubadours sneaking Provençal phrases into hymns, legal documents slowly adopting local tongues for clarity. These were cracks in the monolith, hints of a future where knowledge would democratize. But for centuries, Latin held firm as the vault door guarding Europe's intellectual treasury. The wandering scholars who mastered it didn't just learn a language, they gained a key to the collective mind of their age, one that let them whisper across time to those who would follow. While Latin scholars debated in chilly northern cathedrals, a parallel intellectual revolution was unfolding under the Mediterranean sun. The Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Persia, had become the torchbearer of ancient knowledge, not by hoarding it, but through a culture of relentless inquiry and exchange. Cities like Cordoba, Toledo, and Palermo buzzed with scholars who saw no contradiction between studying Aristotle and the Quran, between dissecting cadavers and composing poetry. For European wanderers brave enough to cross cultural frontiers, these were the libraries of Alexandria reborn. Take Toledo in the 12th century, a city where church bells mingled with the muezzin's call. After Christian forces reclaimed it in 1085, they didn't dismantle its intellectual legacy, they built upon it. The city's Arabic-speaking Jewish and Christian translators became Europe's unsung middlemen, rendering hundreds of texts from Arabic into Latin. Among them was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian who supposedly came to Toledo seeking Ptolemy's Almagest and stayed to translate 87 works on everything from optics to zoology. His workshop was a microcosm of medieval globalization, Mozarabic Christians dictating Arabic to Jewish scribes who wrote in Romance, then scholars like Gerard crafting Latin versions. This wasn't just translation, it was alchemy, turning leaden ignorance into golden understanding. Then there's Constantine the African, a figure shrouded in legend. Born in Tunis, he allegedly fled his homeland with a trove of medical manuscripts, reaching Salerno's famed medical school around 1077. His Latin translations of Arabic works by Ibn Sina and al-Razi introduced Europe to systematic diagnostics, pharmacy, and even psychosomatic medicine. Before Constantine, European healers relied on charms and bloodletting. After him, they debated the four humors and clinical observation. His greatest gift wasn't just knowledge but method, the idea that medicine could be taught, tested, and refined. What made these exchanges possible? Geography and politics conspired to create rare spaces of coexistence. In Sicily, Norman rulers like Roger Roman II employed Arab geographers to chart their kingdom, resulting in maps so precise they'd guide crusaders. At the court of Alfonso X in Castile, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian astronomers collaborated on the Alphonsine tables, predicting celestial movements with unprecedented accuracy. Even the architecture told a story. The Palermo Palace's Arabic inscriptions sat alongside Byzantine mosaics, a physical metaphor for intellectual fusion. Yet this wasn't a simple transfer from east to west. Arabic scholars had themselves built upon Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions. The astronomical theories reaching Europe via Toledo had been refined in Baghdad using data from Sanskrit texts. The algebra Europeans struggled to comprehend had roots in Babylonian problems solved centuries before Muhammad. The wandering scholars who carried these ideas weren't just couriers, they were participants in a conversation spanning millennia and continents. The real friction came when these ideas met Europe's institutional rigidities. Arabic medicine's emphasis on empirical observation clashed with Galenic dogma. Aristotelian physics, filtered through Ibn Rushd's commentaries, challenged theological certainties. Some scholars, like Abelard of Bath, embraced the tension, writing, "From the Arabs I take what is useful, not what is fashionable." Others, like the Parisian theologians who banned Aristotle's works in 1210, saw danger in foreign knowledge. This push and pull defined Europe's scientific awakening, an awakening made possible by travelers willing to risk heresy charges for a glimpse of a better truth. What's often overlooked is how these exchanges weren't just about high science. Everyday innovations slipped through too. The Arabic sukkar became sugar, transforming European diets. Paper-making techniques from Samarkand replaced costly parchment, democratizing writing. Even the humble astrolabe, a navigational tool refined by Arabic craftsmen, found its way onto European ships, guiding explorers toward horizons their mapmakers couldn't yet imagine. The medieval knowledge economy dealt not just in ideas but in the tools to spread them. By the 13th century, this cross-pollination bore spectacular fruit. Robert Grosseteste in Oxford drew on Arabic optics to theorize about light and rainbows. Fibonacci imported Arabic numerals to Italy, revolutionizing mathematics. Albertus Magnus, inspired by translations of Ibn Sina, began cataloging plants and minerals with a naturalist's eye. None of this would have been possible without the translators and travelers who turned Toledo's alleyways and Salerno's clinics into the Silicon Valleys of their age. Their legacy reminds us that progress has never been the product of isolated genius, but of borders crossed both on maps and in minds. In the bustling souks of Toledo and the sun-drenched courtyards of Provence, a different kind of scholar moved silently between worlds. Jewish intellectuals who became the medieval era's most versatile bridge builders. While monks copied Latin texts and Arab philosophers debated Aristotle, these multilingual scholars navigated the spaces in between, turning cultural crossroads into thriving hubs of translation and debate. Consider the vibrant Jewish quarter of 12th century Barcelona, where a single manuscript might bear Hebrew marginalia, Arabic diagrams, and Latin headings, a physical testament to the intellectual fluidity these thinkers embodied. Unlike their Christian or Muslim counterparts, Jewish scholars often lacked institutional power, but this very marginality gave them freedom to synthesize ideas across traditions. They weren't just translators, they were human switchboards connecting Athens, Baghdad, and Paris across time and space. At the forefront stood figures like Maimonides, the Cordoba-born polymath whose medical treatises were studied in Christian monasteries and whose philosophical masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, wrestled with Aristotle's ideas in Hebrew and Arabic. When Christian Europe banned autopsies, Jewish physicians in Montpellier and Salerno trained on Maimonides' writings quietly advanced anatomy. His works didn't just circulate, they mutated, with Latin scribes adding Christian glosses, Arab scholars citing him in debates, and Jewish students in Provence debating his reconciliation of faith and reason. This cross-pollination reveals a hidden truth. Medieval scholarship wasn't a straight line from east to west, but a web where ideas ricocheted between cultures through Jewish intermediaries. The real engine of this exchange was translation and art Jewish scholars perfected. In Toledo's collaborative workshops, a single text might pass through 4 hands, an Arabic-speaking Jew dictating to a scribe writing Romance, a Christian cleric rendering it into Latin, then a Jewish philosopher vetting the accuracy. The Tolden tables, astronomical charts blending Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin data, became so essential that Copernicus later referenced them. Meanwhile, in Provence, the Ibn Tibbon family, a dynasty of translators, turned Arabic scientific works into crisp Hebrew, creating a pipeline of knowledge that bypassed Europe's Latin bottleneck. Their translations of Galen and Hippocrates reached Christian Europe via Jewish physicians serving in royal courts, proving that ideas could slip past political barriers through shared professional networks. What's often missed is how these scholars didn't merely transmit knowledge, they transformed it. Take Abraham Bar Hiyya, the Barcelona mathematician who adapted Arabic algebra into Hebrew geometric proofs, then saw his work plagiarized without credit by Latin scholars. Or Profiat Duran, whose Hebrew grammar treatises borrowed from Arabic linguistic theory while quietly critiquing Christian Trinitarian logic. Their intellectual agility stemmed from necessity. Living as minorities under both Muslim and Christian rule, they developed a knack for coding subversive ideas in seemingly neutral texts. A commentary on Aristotle might conceal a rebuttal to Islamic determinism. A medical manual could subtly challenge church doctrines on the soul. The tragedy and the triumph of these networks lies in their fragility. When the Almohads persecuted non-Muslims in 12th century Spain, Maimonides' family fled to Morocco disguised as Muslims. When Paris expelled Jews in 1182, cartloads of Hebrew-Arabic translations vanished into private collections. Yet each disruption scattered scholars further, seeding knowledge in unexpected places. A Jewish doctor exiled from Andalusia might resurface in Naples, carrying surgical techniques that would influence the Salerno school. A merchant banker expelled from France could settle in Alexandria, trading medical manuscripts like currency. Their legacy whispers through the cracks of history, in the Hebrew annotations on a Latin Aristotle manuscript at Oxford, in the Judeo-Arabic star charts used by Venetian navigators, even in the quills and ink recipes borrowed by monastic scribes. These scholars remind us that the medieval world wasn't divided into rigid religious camps, but threaded together by individuals who refused to let dogma dictate the boundaries of thought. While popes and caliphs wielded power, it was often the scribe in the corner, fluent in 3 languages, versed in 4 traditions, who quietly shaped what future generations would call knowledge. By the 12th century, the wandering scholar's restless pursuit of knowledge began crystallizing into something revolutionary: the first universities. Picture the bustling streets of Bologna around 1088, where what started as informal clusters of law students gathering around charismatic teachers evolved into Europe's oldest degree-granting institution. These weren't the ivy-clad campuses we imagine today, but dynamic, often chaotic ecosystems where learning happened in rented halls, church porches, even open fields. The shift from nomadic study to fixed universities wasn't a clean break. It was more like herding cats, as fiercely independent scholars reluctantly traded some freedom for stability. What fueled this transformation? Demand and danger. As cathedral schools swelled with students, conflicts erupted over housing, fees, and academic freedom. In Paris, when the charismatic philosopher Peter Abelard was driven out by church authorities in 1121, his disciples followed him into exile, proving that loyalty to teachers often outweighed institutional ties. This volatility pushed scholars and students alike to seek formal protections. By banding together into universitas, a medieval term meaning guild, they could negotiate rights, set curricula, and defend against interference from local bishops or rowdy townsfolk. The University of Paris's charter in 1200, recognizing scholars' right to self-governance, marked a watershed. Knowledge wasn't just a pursuit, it was now a protected profession. Yet these early universities retained the wandering spirit of their roots. The nation system in places like Bologna and Paris divided students not by subject but by geographic origin. Normans studying alongside Saxons, Castilians debating Catalans. These weren't just administrative categories, they created microcosms of Europe itself, where a law student from Scotland might share a dormitory with a medical scholar from Naples. The nations competed fiercely in debates and riots alike. Bologna's Italian and Germanic factions famously brawled in 1228, but they also forged a shared identity. When a French scholar invoked "we students" in a letter, he wasn't referring to his hometown but to a transnational community of learning, the real surprise. How much mobility survived institutionalization? Teachers still migrated between universities like academic mercenaries, lured by better pay or intellectual freedom. The English scholar John of Salisbury studied in Paris under Abelard, then taught in Chartres before serving as Bishop of Chartres, a career path spanning borders and disciplines. Students, too, often attended multiple universities, collecting different specialties like modern conference badges. A medical degree from Salerno, a law credential from Bologna, and theology training from Paris made a scholar unstoppable. This peripatetic culture turned universities into nodes in a sprawling network, where ideas circulated as freely as the people carrying them. The curriculum itself bore the marks of its itinerant origins. The 7 liberal arts remained foundational, but now specialized faculties for law, medicine, and theology emerged, each tracing back to geographic knowledge hubs. Bologna became synonymous with legal studies thanks to Irnerius's groundbreaking work with Roman law texts. Salerno's medical expertise, enriched by Arabic and Jewish traditions, gained formal structure. Paris's theology faculty, though conservative, inadvertently fostered innovation by forcing scholars like Thomas Aquinas to reconcile Aristotle with Christian doctrine. These weren't arbitrary strengths, they were institutionalized versions of the knowledge trails wandering scholars had blazed for centuries. Yet for all their structure, early universities faced the same old tensions. Town-gown conflicts erupted when rowdy students, often armed, clashed with locals over rents and tavern bills. Church authorities fretted over heresies spreading through lecture halls. Even the vaunted academic freedom had limits when Parisian scholars embraced Aristotle's pagan philosophy too enthusiastically. The church banned his works in 1210. The difference now, scholars had a home base to push back from. The University of Paris's strike in 1229, when masters suspended lectures to protest rights violations, showed how collective bargaining could defend intellectual space. The most enduring legacy of this transition was the birth of the degree system. What began as a teaching license, licentia docendi, essentially a guild certificate proving mastery, evolved into bachelor's, master's, and doctoral distinctions. These credentials weren't just accolades, they were passports recognized across Europe's academic landscape. A law degree from Bologna opened doors in Oxford. A Parisian theology diploma carried weight in Prague. Standardization had arrived, but so had something subtler, a quality control mechanism that let ideas travel without their originators. A scholar could die, but his annotated textbooks and trained students kept his thoughts circulating. What's often overlooked is how these universities, for all their Latin formality, became incubators for vernacular learning. As lectures grew more sophisticated, students scribbled notes in French, Italian, or German between the lines of Latin text. These marginal jottings, once seen as crutches for weak Latinists, reveal a quiet revolution, the slow seepage of academic knowledge into local languages. By 1300, Dante was crafting his Divine Comedy in Italian, peppered with university-level philosophy. The wandering scholar's dream of accessible knowledge was inching toward reality, one translated gloss at a time. The university system didn't kill the wandering scholar, it gave their mission permanence. Where lone travelers had once carried fragile scrolls, now there were libraries, lecture halls, and generations of students to carry ideas forward. But the DNA of those early Romans lived on in the wandering professors, who still circulated between institutions, in the students who undertook perilous journeys to hear a famed lecturer, even in the manuscripts that continued traveling, now with university seals as their visas. The medieval university's greatest innovation wasn't its buildings or bureaucracies, but its proof that knowledge could be both rooted and restless, anchored in place yet forever crossing borders. Imagine strapping everything you know to your back literally. A wandering scholar's toolkit wasn't just a collection of objects, it was a portable intellectual universe, each item carefully chosen to withstand roads that could snap cart axles and weather that bled ink from parchment. At its heart lay the wax tablet, the medieval equivalent of a rugged notebook. These hinged wooden panels filled with beeswax could be scratched with a stylus, smoothed clean, and reused endlessly, perfect for jotting down lecture notes in a drafty cathedral or drafting letters by firelight. When the message was too precious to erase, it might be copied onto parchment, but that luxury came at a cost. A single sheet of parchment required the skin of an entire sheep, scraped thin and treated with pumice, making books so valuable they were sometimes chained to desks. Yet weight was the enemy. A scholar traveling from Paris to Bologna might carry just one prized volume, perhaps a compendium of Aristotle's works, its pages trimmed to the bare text to save bulk. Between the lines and in the margins, his handwritten notes would spider across the page, a palimpsest of borrowed wisdom and original thought. For reference, he'd rely on a floralgium, a bouquet of quotations from trusted authorities, painstakingly compiled over years. These weren't just study aids, they were intellectual lifelines, distilling libraries into a single portable volume. And if danger loomed, some manuscripts were designed for concealment, their bindings hollowed to hide smaller texts or even maps folded like origami into psalter covers. Navigation demanded its own tools. While wealthy travelers might commission maps, most scholars relied on the sun, stars, and hearsay. An astrolabe, borrowed from Arabic navigators, could pinpoint latitude or calculate prayer times, if one mastered its brass dials and etched coordinates. More humble but no less vital was the itinerarium, a list of waypoints between cities with notes like "turn left at the ruined mill" or "avoid the innkeeper who waters his wine." These were mental maps passed between travelers like gossip and refined through shared experience. Survival tools doubled as scholarly aids. A knife wasn't just for cutting bread, it sharpened quills, scraped parchment clean of errors, and even served as a page marker. Inks traveled as dried pellets, mixed with rainwater or wine in makeshift camps. The most precious vial held in caustum, a coveted iron gall ink that bit into parchment, making words resistant to moisture. But accidents happened. Manuscripts still bear the ghostly stains of candle wax and the imprints of fingers smudged with sweat and dirt, tangible proof of study sessions in leaky inns or under roadside oaks. The true test came in winter. Frozen ink forced scholars to dictate rather than write. Books, stiff with cold, cracked at the spines if opened too hastily. Yet even then, the toolkit adapted. Wax tablets worked in sub-zero temperatures when parchment became brittle. Memory techniques, honed in monastic schools, let scholars store entire texts mentally until warmer days. One 12th century manual advised wrapping books in wool and sleeping with them to prevent condensation, a literal embrace of knowledge. What's easy to overlook is how these tools shaped thought itself. The wax tablet's impermanence encouraged bold, experimental drafts. The astrolabe's precision nurtured a habit of empirical observation. Even the humble quill had a voice. Goose feathers made finer lines for delicate commentary, while crow feathers offered sturdier strokes for polemics. Each object wasn't just functional, it was a silent partner in the act of thinking. When we digitize books today, we lose the tactile struggles that birthed them. The cramp from hours copying texts, the sting of ink-stained fingers, the ache of shoulders bearing a library's weight. Yet those struggles forged a discipline modern learners rarely experience. Every smear of wax, every ink correction, every mile walked to verify a fact, these were the invisible costs behind the gloss of illuminated manuscripts. The wandering scholar's greatest tool wasn't in their satchels at all. It was their willingness to bear those costs, to let knowledge wear them down as they carried it forward. The road was a scholar's greatest classroom and their most lethal adversary. For every manuscript safely delivered to a waiting patron, there were a dozen journeys that ended in disaster. Carts overturned in swollen rivers, precious books bartered for safe passage, or worse, ambushes in lonely stretches of forest where bandits cared more for a traveler's cloak than their cargo of wisdom. Gerald of Wales, the fiery 12th century chronicler, left us one of the most vivid accounts of these perils. Traveling through Ireland to document its church reforms, he found himself dodging more than just theological debates. His party was stalked by armed men in the Wicklow Mountains, forced to ford treacherous streams where horses lost their footing, and once narrowly avoided a nighttime raid by lighting torches to mimic a larger convoy. The scholar's staff, he wryly noted, is no match for a brigand's axe, yet physical danger was just the beginning. Local rulers, suspicious of outsiders bearing strange ideas, often posed graver threats. In 1141, the philosopher Gilbert de la Porree was arrested in Poitiers under charges of heresy, his manuscripts confiscated by a count who couldn't tell Aristotle from Augustine. Without the intervention of powerful church allies, Gilbert might have faced execution instead of eventual exoneration. This was the double-edged sword of medieval travel. The same roads that connected thinkers also exposed them to arbitrary justice. A scholar debating theology in Paris could find themselves branded a heretic in Lombardy, where local bishops enforced doctrine with draconian zeal. Survival often hinged on paperwork, a paradox in an age before passports. Letters of recommendation from abbots or bishops served as both credential and lifeline, their wax seals functioning like diplomatic immunity. The 12th century scholar John of Salisbury carried a letter from Bernard of Clairvaux that famously declared, "Whoever harms this man harms me." Such endorsements weren't just polite introductions, they were shields against accusations of espionage or witchcraft. Ecclesiastical safe conduct, though, had limits. When the scholar and translator Michael Scott traveled through Frederick Roman II realms in Sicily, he relied on the emperor's personal protection, a privilege that vanished the moment he crossed into papal territory, where his astrological studies made him a suspect figure. Weather wielded its own brutality. The Alpine passes, vital arteries between northern and southern Europe, were death traps for the unprepared. Snowdrift swallowed entire parties whole, as happened to a group of Bologna law students in 1234. Spring thaws turned roads into quagmires, forcing scholars to detour through bandit-infested woods. Even the rhythms of travel were fraught. Summer brought malaria in lowland regions, while autumn rains made rivers impassable. Many scholars timed their journeys to coincide with pilgrim routes, where safety lay in numbers, though mixing with pious travelers carried its own risks. A Flemish grammarian satchel stuffed with classical poetry was once tossed into a fire by zealots who mistook Ovid's verses for sorcery. The psychological toll was just as sharp. Loneliness gnawed at travelers separated from their intellectual communities for years. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin poured his homesickness into letters, writing from Charlemagne's court. "I hunger for the talk of my brothers, for the laughter that sparks like flint in the cloister." Others grappled with identity whiplash, shifting between cultures where the same ideas were revered or reviled. Abelard of Bath, returning from Antioch with Arabic scientific texts, faced accusations of pagan contamination from colleagues who'd never ventured beyond their hometowns. Yet for all its dangers, the road also forged unexpected alliances. When bandits robbed the French philosopher Peter Abelard near Lyon, it was a group of Jewish merchants who sheltered him, an act of kindness repaid years later when Abelard defended Jewish communities in his lectures. These fleeting connections reveal a hidden truth. The medieval world, for all its divisions, was knit together by countless small acts of trust between strangers. Every safe passage, every shared firelight, every borrowed cloak was a silent pact between those who believed knowledge was worth the risk. The scars left by these journeys linger in the manuscripts themselves. A water-stained page might mark a near drowning in the Loire. Gutter margins chewed by rodents hint at nights spent in barns. Even the handwriting sometimes fractures mid-text, as if the scribe's fingers were stiff from frostbite. These imperfections aren't flaws, they're testament to the brutal calculus of medieval learning, that every idea we take for granted today was bought with someone's hunger, fear, and unshakable determination to keep walking. Behind every manuscript copied and every lecture delivered lay a pressing question: how did wandering scholars put food on their makeshift desks? The medieval knowledge economy ran on a patchwork of precarious funding, where a scholar's survival often hinged on their ability to charm patrons, haggle over fees, and sometimes outright beg. At the top of this hierarchy stood scholars like Alcuin of York, whose position at Charlemagne's court came with land grants, servants, and a steady stream of imperial favor. For these elite few, intellectual labor wasn't just rewarded, it was lavishly subsidized. Charlemagne didn't merely pay Alcuin, he built him an entire school at the palace in Aachen, understanding that investing in minds was as strategic as funding armies. But for every Alcuin, there were 100 unknown scholars scraping by on thin soup and thinner parchment. Take the wandering Goliards, disreputable poet-scholars of the 12th century, who drifted between cathedral towns, composing satirical verses in exchange for wine and spare coin. Their raucous drinking songs, like the famous Carmina Burana, masked a grim reality. These were often dropout clerics or failed university students, their Latin fluency their only marketable skill. In taverns and market squares, they performed like intellectual buskers, trading epigrams for crusts of bread. One surviving poem pleads, "The scholar's purse is light as air, his belly lighter still, yet who will pay for all his books or foot his mounting bill?" The rise of universities introduced a new economic model, the freelance lecturer. In Bologna, law professors like Irnerius charged students directly, creating a competitive marketplace where fame equaled income. A popular teacher could demand fees in advance, while lesser-known scholars might pass a hat after lectures. This system bred innovation. Professors developed the repetitio, a kind of medieval TD talk where they'd summarize complex legal cases dramatically to attract larger crowds. But it also fostered inequality. When the brilliant but abrasive Peter Abelard fell out of favor in Paris, his income evaporated overnight, forcing him to rebuild his reputation at the remote Paraclete monastery. Manuscript production offered another precarious lifeline. Skilled copyists could earn steady wages in monastic scriptoriums, but independent scholars relied on piecework, copying texts for wealthy patrons or producing bespoke volumes for noble clients. The margins of these books sometimes reveal bitter negotiations. For this psalter, 5 silver pennies, no more, no less, or may the ink fade from the page. Some scholars turned entrepreneur, like the 14th century Oxford stationer Thomas Gloyn, who ran a manuscript subscription service, taking advance payments to commission luxury books. Yet even this was risky. When a patron reneged on payment, the scholar was left holding a costly parchment stack. The darkest side of this economy was sheer destitution. Elderly scholars, their eyes too weak for copying, often appear in guild records as paupers. Church alms lists from Canterbury and Charters include entries like, "Brother Henry, once a teacher, now blind, grant him bread and a corner by the fire." Some turned to forgery, altering documents for local lords. Others sold miracle cures based on half-remembered Arabic medical texts. The line between scholar and charlatan grew thin when hunger gnawed. Yet within this unequal system flickered the origins of modern academia. The freelance model pioneered in Bologna and Paris evolved into today's adjunct professors and independent researchers. Patronage transformed into grants and fellowships. Even the tension between secure institutional positions and risky independent scholarship mirrors our own gig economy. The medieval scholars' struggle to monetize expertise without sacrificing integrity feels eerily familiar. When a Goliard's poem laments, "Gold flows to fools and fighters while thinkers starve unseen," it echoes across 8 centuries to every underpaid tutor and overlooked researcher. Their world shaped ours in ways we're only beginning to reckon with. History often paints medieval scholarship as a male-dominated world, but scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find women quietly shaping the intellectual currents of their time. Behind convent walls and in royal courts, they wielded quills with the same precision as their male counterparts, though their contributions were often relegated to footnotes or attributed to anonymous brothers. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose scientific and mystical writings defied the era's expectations. Her Physica, a groundbreaking study of natural medicine, detailed the healing properties of plants and gems with a clarity that put many male physicians to shame. But what's often overlooked is how she leveraged her spiritual authority to create a space for female scholarship. Her convent at Rupertsberg became a nerve center of learning, where nuns composed music, copied manuscripts, and even practiced medicine, all under the cloak of religious devotion. Then there's the enigmatic Trotula of Salerno, a name that sparked centuries of debate. Was she one woman or a composite of many? The texts attributed to her De Mulierum Passionibus are on women's ailments, revolutionized gynecology with their insistence that women's health required specialized knowledge. Male scribes later tried to erase her, scribbling out her name and attributing her work to male authors. Yet her ideas persisted, circulating in vernacular translations where midwives and healers kept them alive. The real scandal, Trotula's work wasn't just about childbirth. It challenged the Aristotelian notion that women were imperfect men, arguing instead for a holistic view of female physiology. Her voice, though muffled by time, whispers through the pages of medical manuals well into the Renaissance. Convents were the stealth universities of medieval Europe. In scriptoriums like those at Chelles or Gandersheim, nuns produced illuminated manuscripts rivaling those of male monasteries. The Gutta Sintram Codex, created by the nun Gutta and the monk Sintram in 12th century Alsace, reveals a collaboration where female artistry shone. Gutta's vibrant illustrations weren't mere decoration. They were theological arguments in pigment, translating complex ideas for illiterate audiences. These women didn't just copy texts, they annotated, debated, and sometimes subverted them. A 9th century psalter from Kassel bears marginal notes in a nun's hand critiquing a bishop's interpretation of scripture, a daring act in an age when female dissent could be dangerous. Beyond the cloister, noble women acted as intellectual patrons and polymaths. Helena of Aquitaine's court became a haven for troubadours and scholars, while her daughter, Marie de France, penned lies that wove Celtic folklore with Ovidian elegance. In Spain, the Jewish poet Casmuna bint Isma Macron letter 2b, fil composed verses in Arabic and Hebrew, her salon attracting thinkers from across the Mediterranean. Even the Byzantine princess Anna Komnene, exiled to a convent, wrote the Alexiad, a history of her father's reign so meticulously researched it's still cited by scholars today. The real tragedy lies in the fragility of their legacy. Women's works were less likely to be systematically copied or stored in cathedral libraries. Many survive only in fragments, like the recipe book of the nun Herad of Landsberg, which included scientific diagrams alongside devotional texts. Others were corrected by male scribes, their original voices sanded down to fit orthodox expectations. Yet their influence seeped into unexpected places: folk medicine, liturgical music, even the design of herbal gardens. The next time you see a medieval manuscript with delicate marginalia, look closer. Those flourishes might just be the signature of a woman who refused to let her intellect be contained. The bustling manuscript markets of medieval Europe were more than just places to buy books. They were the social media hubs of their age, where ideas went viral long before the printing press. Picture the crowded stalls of Florence's annual book fair in the 14th century, where merchants from Venice haggled over parchment quality, while scholars from Oxford debated the latest translations of Avicenna. The air would have been thick with the scent of ink and leather, the din of negotiations mixing with the scratch of quills as scribes demonstrated their craft. Unlike the silent scriptoriums of monasteries, these were spaces of lively commerce, where knowledge wasn't just revered, it was priced, bartered, and sometimes even smuggled. Producing a single manuscript was an epic feat of labor. It began with the parchment maker, soaking, scraping, and stretching animal hides into smooth sheets. A scribe might spend months copying text, their hand cramping as they meticulously reproduced each letter in ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Then came the illuminator, grinding precious pigments like lapis lazuli into vibrant blues that glowed like stained glass. Gold leaf was applied with a brush made of squirrel hair, each delicate stroke doubling the book's value. The final product, a Bible, a legal compendium, or a medical treatise, could cost as much as a peasant's yearly wages. No wonder wealthy patrons sometimes commissioned books as displays of power, their coats of arms woven into the margins like medieval copyright stamps. Yet this painstaking process was riddled with human error. A drowsy scribe in a chilly scriptorium might skip a line or misread a word, accidentally turning Aristotle's "the soul is immortal" into "the soil is immortal." These mistakes, called variants, could ripple across generations as flawed copies were recopied. Some errors were caught. Annotations in surviving manuscripts show monks debating corrections in the margins, but others took on lives of their own. A 12th century copy of Pliny's Natural History described a mythical bird called the cynomolgus that built nests from cinnamon. The error, a misreading of cinnamon traders, spawned fantastical illustrations in bestiaries for centuries. The medieval equivalent of a typo could literally rewrite history. The Florentine fairs revealed the manuscript trade's darker edges too. Forgers rubbed out original texts to resell parchment as new, creating palimpsests where ghostly layers of erased writing lingered beneath. Unscrupulous dealers might stitch together fragments from different authors, selling them as complete works. Even legitimate trade had its hazards. When the scholar Poggio Bracciolini rediscovered Lucretius on the nature of things in a German monastery in 1418, he had to bribe the monks with a barrel of wine to part with it. The manuscript, copied from a 9th century original, had survived purely by chance, its pagan content nearly condemned as heresy. What's often overlooked is how these markets became engines of cultural blending. A merchant from Cairo might trade an Arabic medical text for a French legal manuscript, each crossing linguistic frontiers they were never meant to breach. Jewish scribes in Spain produced trilingual dictionaries to meet demand, while Italian traders developed a thriving side business in used books, manuscripts salvaged from dissolved monasteries or estates. The very act of buying and selling became a form of intellectual cross-pollination, as marginal notes in one language sparked ideas in another. The commercial side of scholarship had its critics. Church reformers railed against the venal scribes who prioritized profits over piety, while universities tried to regulate prices to keep essential texts affordable. Yet without this messy, competitive marketplace, many classics would have molded in obscurity. The manuscript trade, for all its flaws, was the circulatory system of medieval thought, pumping ideas from cloisters to courts, from Toledo to Tuscany, one painstakingly copied page at a time. Some scholars didn't just carry knowledge, they lit it on fire and tossed it into the intellectual powder kegs of their time. Take Peter Abelard, the 12th century philosopher whose razor-sharp logic sliced through theological certainties like a hot knife through parchment. His infamous affair with Heloise might dominate the history books, but his true scandal was insisting that faith should withstand the scrutiny of reason. In his Sic et Non, Yes and No, he compiled contradictory statements from church fathers without resolving them, a radical act in an era that demanded tidy orthodoxy. To Abelard, doubt wasn't heresy, it was the very engine of understanding. The backlash was swift. His books were burned at the Council of Soissons in 1121, and his rival Bernard of Clairvaux denounced him as a dragon spewing poison. Yet even in exile, Abelard's students smuggled his ideas across Europe, proving that suppressed thoughts have a way of seeping through castle walls. Then there's Roger Bacon, the 13th century Franciscan who dared to suggest that experimentation, not just ancient texts, could reveal nature's secrets. In an age when Aristotle's word was gospel, Bacon's Opus Maius argued for optics, alchemy, and even gunpowder research. His vision of flying machines and submarines earned him the nickname Dr. Mirabilis, wonderful teacher, but it also landed him under house arrest. Church authorities distrusted his magical pursuits, though Bacon insisted he sought only to unlock God's workshop, his real crime, suggesting that truth might lie beyond the pages of approved manuscripts. These mavericks shared a common trait. They treated tradition as a starting point, not a prison. When the Spanish Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd Averroes argued that reason and religion could coexist, His books were torched in Cordoba, only for Jewish translators in Provence to salvage his ideas and funnel them into Latin Europe. Similarly, the mystic Meister Eckhart's sermons on the God beyond God so unnerved the Church that he died defending himself against heresy charges in 1328. Yet his radical spirituality would later inspire thinkers from Hegel to Heidegger. What's often overlooked is how these conflicts shaped intellectual progress itself. Censorship bred creativity. Abelard's dialectical method, born from his need to defend unorthodox views, became the foundation of medieval disputation. Bacon's persecution forced him to encode his most daring theories in cryptic language, inadvertently pioneering the peer review system by sharing drafts only with trusted colleagues. Even failures left fingerprints when the Church condemned the nominalist philosopher William of Ockham in 1326. His flight to the Bavarian court turned him into a political theorist whose ideas on power and liberty would echo in the Enlightenment. The price of dissent was steep. Marguerite Porreet, a Beguine mystic, was burned at the stake in 1310 for her book The Mirror of Simple Souls, which suggested divine love transcended church rituals. Her manuscript survived only because inquisitors ironically copied it as evidence. The Jewish scholar Gersonides faced excommunication from his own community in Provence for applying Aristotelian logic to the Torah, while the Catalan polymath Ramon Llull Berli escaped assassination after suggesting Muslims could be converted through philosophical debate rather than crusades. Yet their legacies reveal an uncomfortable truth. Medieval thought advanced precisely where friction flared brightest. Abelard's questioning birthed scholasticism. Bacon's empiricism foreshadowed the scientific method. The very institutions that silenced them inadvertently preserved their ideas. Heresy trials generated meticulous records of dangerous theories, ensuring they'd resurface when the world caught up. These scholars remind us that progress has never been a straight path, but a winding road paved with burnt books, midnight debates, and the stubborn courage to think differently. The Black Death didn't just decimate populations, it shattered the very scaffolding of medieval learning. When the plague swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, it struck with terrifying impartiality, felling peasants and professors alike. Oxford lost nearly two-thirds of its scholars. Entire monastic scriptoriums fell silent as scribes succumbed to the pestilence. The meticulous networks of knowledge exchange, letters carried by couriers, manuscripts loaned between monasteries, students traveling to study under famed masters collapsed like bridges in a flood. Yet from this chaos emerged an unexpected revolution, the democratization of education. With so many Latin-trained clerics dead, the Church had no choice but to recruit laypeople to fill vacant positions. Suddenly, butchers' sons and merchants' daughters found doors swinging open to worlds of learning that had once been barred by birth and language. Latin's iron grip on scholarship began to loosen as practicality trumped tradition. Why spend years mastering a dead language when vernacular texts could train priests faster? In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in Italian, not Latin, became a runaway success, proving that complex ideas could thrive outside academic jargon. Across the Channel, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales did the same for English, its earthy humor and vivid characters making literature accessible to anyone who could read their mother tongue. Even sacred texts weren't immune. By 1382, John Wycliffe's followers were producing the first complete Bible in English, an act so radical it would later be condemned as heresy. The plague hadn't just killed people, it had wounded the mystique of elite knowledge. Universities, once the exclusive domain of the privileged, adapted out of necessity. Bologna and Paris streamlined their curricula, condensing years of study into intensive courses for emergency replacements. Medical schools, desperate to fill the void left by dead physicians, began accepting students without classical training, so long as they could demonstrate practical skills. The stereotype of the absent-minded scholar gave way to a new ideal, the pragmatic learner, one who valued results over rhetorical flourishes. This shift birthed unexpected innovations. At Montpellier's medical faculty, where Arabic texts had long been studied in secret, professors now openly integrated Islamic surgical techniques into lectures. In Prague, the newly founded Charles University embraced vernacular debates alongside Latin disputations, a move that would later fuel the fires of the Hussite Reformation. The plague's most enduring gift might have been its assault on authority itself. When trusted institutions, the church, the medical establishment, the aristocracy failed to stop the dying, people began questioning all received wisdom. Survivors pored over vernacular plague tracts, some blaming miasmas, others astrology, a few even daring to suggest sanitation might help. This newfound skepticism seeped into scholarship. The 14th century Oxford calculators, a group of radical thinkers, began applying mathematical logic to physics problems that Aristotle had hand-waved away. Their work on motion and velocity, though couched in medieval terms, would later influence Galileo. Similarly, the devastation of monastic libraries forced scholars to rely on memory and improvisation, leading to creative syntheses of surviving fragments. The Italian humanist Petrarch, rummaging through plague-emptied abbeys for classical texts, famously declared, "We must invent what we cannot inherit." Yet adaptation came at a cost. The rush to replace lost clerics meant many new priests had only superficial training, leading to a surge in folk Christianity that blended orthodox doctrine with local superstitions. Cheaply produced vernacular books, while revolutionary, often contained errors that distorted complex ideas, and the decline of Latin as a shared scholarly language would eventually balkanize European thought, making transnational debates harder just as they were needed most. The Black Death hadn't just changed education, it had fractured the medieval world's intellectual unity, setting the stage for both the Renaissance's creativity and the Reformation's divisions. In the end, the plague proved a ruthless editor of history, crossing out entire chapters of tradition while leaving blank spaces where new stories could be written. The quill's reign lasted 1,000 years until a goldsmith in Mainz built a machine that would shatter the medieval world of knowledge. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, perfected around 1450, didn't just accelerate book production, it rewrote the rules of intellectual exchange. Where a wandering scholar might spend months transcribing a single manuscript by candlelight, Gutenberg's movable type could stamp out 300 pages in a day, each letter crisp and identical. The difference wasn't merely quantitative, it was existential. For the first time, two readers in separate countries could hold identical copies of the same text, down to the pagination and errant ink smudge. The age of personalized knowledge, where every manuscript bore the quirks of its scribe, was giving way to something unprecedented, standardization. Yet this revolution didn't emerge from a vacuum. Gutenberg's press stood on foundations laid by those very wandering scholars it would displace. The dense networks of cathedral schools and universities, the Latin lingua franca refined through centuries of debate, even the commercial manuscript trade with its hungry markets, all were prerequisites for print success. When early printers chose which texts to mass produce, they turned to the medieval canon painstakingly assembled by generations of travelers, Aristotle's logic, Augustine's theology, Avicenna's medicine. The first printed Bible's Gothic typeface mimicked the handwriting of Rhineland scribes, a nostalgic nod to the scriptorium tradition it was rendering obsolete. Even the press's spread followed old scholarly routes from Mainz to Paris to Oxford, tracing paths worn smooth by generations of footsore intellectuals. The contrast between old and new was stark. A 14th century scholar like Petrarch might wait years to borrow a rare Cicero manuscript, then spend months copying it himself, adding his own glosses between the lines. By 1500, a Venetian printer could produce 500 flawless Ciceros in a month, their margins blank for readers' personal annotations. Knowledge was no longer a fragile flame passed hand to hand. It was a wildfire leaping from city to city. The Nuremberg Chronicle, printed in 1493, boasted over 600 woodcut illustrations, a feat unimaginable in the age of manual illumination. Suddenly, a student in Krakow could study the same diagram of human anatomy as a surgeon in Bologna, down to the precise placement of each labeled vein. But something intangible was lost in this transition. The manuscript era's intimate relationship between scribe and text, where copying was an act of interpretation. Each error or embellishment revealing the scribe's worldview gave way to mechanical reproduction. A monk's marginal doodle of a dragon might become a printer's generic fleuron. A scholar's passionate underlinings were replaced by sterile italics. The human fingerprints on knowledge grew fainter, even as its reach expanded exponentially. Yet for all its impersonality, print democratized learning in ways the wandering scholars could scarcely have dreamed. By 1520, Erasmus, himself a product of the old scholastic world, could quip that his books had traveled farther than he ever had, reaching readers from Lisbon to Lubeck without him ever leaving his study. The real irony, many early printers were themselves intellectual nomads. Gutenberg's assistant Peter Schurfer had studied in Paris. Venetian pioneer Aldus Manutius assembled a team of refugee Greek scholars to produce flawless classical texts. These men understood that the press didn't erase the need for human expertise, it redirected it. Scholars who once roamed to collect manuscripts now congregated in printing hubs like Basel or Lyon to edit standardized editions. The wandering didn't stop, it transformed as foot travel gave way to the migration of ideas through printed sheets. What the medieval scholars would have recognized, and what we often forget, is that technology alone doesn't revolutionize knowledge. It's the intersection of innovation with pre-existing networks, habits, and hunger for learning. Gutenberg's press didn't create the Renaissance. It supercharged intellectual currents already flowing through Europe's scriptoriums, universities, and marketplace stalls. The last wandering scholars, watching their painstakingly copied texts become obsolete, might have taken grim satisfaction in knowing their greatest legacy was making themselves unnecessary. They had built a world where knowledge could finally outpace the speed of a man on foot. Certain cities in medieval Europe didn't just attract scholars, they became living libraries, their very name's shorthand for excellence in specific fields. Salerno, nestled along Italy's rugged Amalfi coast, wasn't merely a town with doctors, it was medicine incarnate. Travelers with festering wounds or mysterious fevers bypassed local healers to journey there, trusting the city's physicians like we might trust a modern Mayo Clinic specialist. What made Salerno extraordinary wasn't just its medical knowledge, but how it blended traditions. Arab traders brought surgical techniques from Baghdad, Jewish physicians contributed pharmacology from North Africa, and Benedictine monks infused it all with herbal remedies from their cloister gardens. By the 11th century, Salerno's medical school, the first of its kind in Europe, had formalized this fusion into a curriculum so advanced that its textbooks, like the Trotula on women's health, remained standard for centuries. Patients didn't just receive treatment, they became case studies, their symptoms meticulously recorded in manuscripts that would train generations. Meanwhile, 500 kilometers north, Bologna was rewriting the rules of justice, literally. Unlike Salerno's focus on bodies, Bologna specialized in the body politic. Its law school, emerging around the 11th century, became the gravitational center for legal minds dissecting Justinian's ancient Roman codes. But here's the twist. Bologna's scholars didn't just study these laws, they resurrected them. The Digest, a 6th century Byzantine legal text, had been gathering dust in Italian libraries until Bolognese professors like Onirius began treating it not as a relic, but as a living blueprint for modern governance. Students from across Europe flocked to hear lectures where Roman property laws were applied to medieval inheritance disputes, or where the concept of corporate personhood was first debated. The city's legal reputation grew so dominant that when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa needed legitimacy for his rule, he came to Bologna in 1155 to earn a jurist's endorsement, an early example of power bowing to expertise. Paris took a different path. By the 12th century, its cathedral schools had evolved into Europe's theology powerhouse, but with a twist of rebellious energy. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a startup hub. Unlike Bologna's structured legalism or Salerno's empirical medicine, Paris thrived on intellectual combat. Scholars like Peter Abelard turned lectures into public spectacles, using logic to pick apart theological orthodoxies. The city's unique status as both a royal capital and ecclesiastical center created a pressure cooker of ideas. Church authorities might ban Aristotle's works one decade, only for Parisian masters to stealthily reintroduce them the next, repackaged as commentaries on Christian thought. This volatile mix birthed scholasticism, a method that would dominate European education for centuries. A degree from Paris wasn't just a credential, it was a badge of honor proving you could hold your own in the most contentious debates of the age. Oxford and Cambridge, though younger, carved their niches through isolation and focus. Far from the Mediterranean's crosscurrents, these English towns became laboratories for scientific inquiry. Robert Grosseteste's work on optics at Oxford in the 13th century, building on Arabic texts but adding rigorous experimentation, pioneered what we'd now call the scientific method. Meanwhile, Cambridge's early strength in mathematics, fueled by scholars like John Peckham, showed how regional hubs could diverge despite proximity. Unlike Paris's theological wars or Bologna's legal precision, the English schools emphasized hands-on study, their meadows and riverbanks serving as open-air classrooms for astronomy and natural philosophy. The real magic of these hubs lay in their ecosystems. Just as Silicon Valley thrives on serendipitous encounters between engineers and investors, medieval academic towns buzzed with chance collaborations. A law student in Bologna might rent a room from a notary drafting contracts, absorbing practical jurisprudence between lectures. In Salerno, Jewish apothecaries supplied medicines to the medical school while secretly sharing Arabic texts with curious students. Parisian scribes near the Sorbonne developed specialized shorthand to capture fast-paced debates, creating an early version of academic publishing. These weren't just centers of learning, they were intellectual marketplaces where knowledge was bartered, stolen, and refined in taverns, scriptoriums, and even brothels, where, as one scandalized chronicler noted, scholars debated between the sheets. What's often overlooked is how these reputations became self-reinforcing. Salerno's medical fame attracted wealthy patrons funding hospitals, which in turn produced more case studies, further burnishing its prestige. Bologna's legal graduates staffed royal courts across Europe, ensuring new rulers sent their own bureaucrats to train there. Paris's theological controversies, though risky, drew the boldest minds eager to make their mark. This created a medieval version of brand loyalty. Once a city became synonymous with a discipline, its dominance could last centuries, immune to shifts in political power. Yet these hubs weren't ivory towers. They owed their success to gritty pragmatism. Salerno's physicians publicly dissected pigs to demonstrate anatomy, shocking but educating lay audiences. Bologna's law professors hired repetators to drill students with mock trials, essentially medieval bar exam prep. Paris's scholars, tired of exploitative landlords, formed housing cooperatives that evolved into the first college dormitories. The lesson, medieval academic excellence, wasn't about lofty ideals alone. It thrived on solving real-world problems, from training competent doctors to preventing student riots over bad ale. Their legacies still echo. The modern university's division into specialized faculties traces back to these regional strengths, the cutthroat competition for top professors. That began when Bologna lured Irnerius from Rome with tax exemptions, or when Paris poached Abelard's rivals. Even our obsession with rankings has medieval roots. Pilgrim guides from the 14th century rated Salerno's medical school superior to Montpellier's, much like today's college rankings. These cities proved that knowledge, when concentrated and curated, could become a commodity more valuable than spices or silk, drawing seekers from every corner of the known world. While Aristotle's Metaphysics and Augustine's City of God dominated medieval libraries, it was the humble herbal, a guide to plants and their uses, that truly shaped daily life, from peasant huts to royal kitchens. Take the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century compendium of medicinal plants that circulated far beyond her Rhineland convent. Unlike philosophical tomes locked in monastic libraries, herbals were workhorses of practicality, their pages stained with dirt and grease from constant use. A village healer in Burgundy might not know Plotto's forms, but she could recite Hildegard's cure for fever using yarrow and honey, a recipe passed down through dog-eared copies traded at fairs. These texts weren't just read, they were lived in, their margins crammed with local additions like "substitute thyme if hyssop is scarce," or "grandmother adds garlic for strength." Equally ubiquitous were the agricultural manuals adapted from Roman writers like Columella and Palladius. A Carolingian estate manager in 9th century France relied on De Villais, a farming guide prescribing crop rotations and orchard maintenance. Its advice so precise it listed how many cheese presses each manor should own. These weren't theoretical tracts but field-tested scripts for survival. When the Geoponica, a Byzantine farming encyclopedia, reached Spain via Arabic translators, its chapters on olive cultivation transformed Andalusia's economy, proof that a single practical text could reshape landscapes more decisively than 100 theological debates. Legal commentaries, though less glamorous than illuminated gospels, wielded outsized influence. The Glossa Ordinaria, a labyrinth of annotations on Roman law compiled in Bologna, became the medieval equivalent of a legal search engine. Judges from London to Krakow consulted its interlinear notes to settle property disputes, while merchants carried pocket-sized summi summarizing contract law. One 13th century Venetian manuscript bears salt stains likely from being consulted aboard ship during trading voyages. Unlike philosophical works debated in Latin, these texts often seeped into vernaculars. The Sachsenspiegel, a German law code from 1220, was so accessible its illustrations of courtroom procedures served as comics for illiterate jurors. The real surprise, how these minor texts crossed cultural boundaries philosophy couldn't. A Hebrew herbal from Provence might borrow Arabic plant names while citing Galen in Latin footnotes. The Tacuinum Sanatotis, a health guide born in Baghdad, migrated to Italy with its original Arabic diagrams intact, teaching Europeans that eggplant could cure headaches if prepared correctly. Even cookbooks became vectors of exchange. The Liber de Coquina, compiled in Naples' multicultural courts, blended Arab sugar techniques, French roasting methods, and Jewish dietary laws into the first truly European cuisine. What these works lacked in grandeur, they made up in durability. While a fire might destroy the sole copy of a theologian's treatise in some remote abbey, hundreds of practical manuscripts survived because they were constantly in use, repaired with scrap parchment, rebound in leather, even memorized when books were scarce. Their legacy lingers in places we'd least expect. The parsley now growing in your garden, recommended by medieval herbals to freshen breath. The inheritance laws still echoing Justinian's codes, even the cheese-making techniques preserved in alpine villages. The forgotten texts remind us that history's most transformative ideas often wore the unassuming cloak of utility, their pages smudged not by candle wax but by the grease of daily labor. In the vibrant stained glass of Chartres Cathedral, amid scenes of saints and biblical kings, a quieter figure often appears, a robed scholar with a weathered satchel, his face lit by the glow of an open book. These artistic depictions weren't mere decoration. They were medieval Europe's way of wrestling with the paradox of the wandering scholar, a figure both revered and distrusted, whose pursuit of knowledge placed him somewhere between monk and vagabond. The illuminated manuscript Hortus Deliciarum from 12th century Alsace captures this duality perfectly. One miniature shows a scholar teaching wide-eyed students under a tree, his scroll unfurled like a banner of wisdom. Just pages later, another image warns of false clerics who peddle heresy, their books clutched like contraband, their staves more weapon than walking aid. Art became the arena where society debated the value and danger of intellectual freedom. Look closer at these depictions and symbolic codes emerge. The book, always centrally placed, was more than a prop, it was a badge of legitimacy. In a fresco at the University of Padua, a scholar holds his tome with both hands, echoing how priests held the Eucharist, suggesting knowledge was its own kind of sacrament. Yet contrast this with misericords, those hidden wooden carvings on choir seats where artisans snuck subversive humor. One in Lincoln Cathedral shows a fox dressed as a scholar, preaching to geese from a pulpit, a biting satire on how learning could mask predation. The staff, another recurring motif, told its own story. In noble portraits, it's a finely carved crozier, symbolizing ecclesiastical authority. But in marginal doodles, it's a gnarled branch, marking the scholar as a perpetual outsider, always between places. The most telling details often lurk in the margins. A 13th century psalter from Paris features a scene of scholars debating, their hands animated but peak at the border, and you'll spot a tiny monkey stealing one man's hat. This playful tension between gravitas and absurdity reflected real societal ambivalence. Were scholars enlightened guides or charlatans selling intellectual snake oil? The Bible Moralise, a luxury picture Bible for French royalty, splits the difference. Its paired images show good scholars correcting texts in orderly scriptoriums, while bad ones hunch over astrolabes in shadowy corners, dabbling in suspect sciences. Sculpture offered even starker commentary. On the facade of Amiens Cathedral, a statue of the Apostle Paul stands beside a scholar, both holding books, but Paul's is upright, divinely inspired, while the scholar's tilts precariously, as if to say human knowledge is forever off balance. More striking are the rooftop gargoyles at Oxford's Merton College, where stone scholars clutch books so tightly their fingers seem fused to the pages, a warning against knowledge hoarding. Even musical instruments carried meaning. A lute in a scholar's hands, like those in the Cantigas de Santa Maria, signaled the harmony of wisdom, while a discarded lute near a drunken cleric in a Flemish painting hinted at knowledge squandered. The true revelation comes when art intersects with real objects. The ivory writing tablets from 10th century Germany mirror those in manuscripts, their tiny hinges and wax surfaces rendered with documentary precision. A bishop's crozier from Limoges, encrusted with enamel scenes of the Magi, those original scholar pilgrims, blurs the line between sacred relic and scholarly tribute. Even mundane items like quills cast in bronze with intricate knotwork suggest their owners saw writing as alchemy, turning base ink into intellectual gold. What's haunting is how these depictions humanize figures often reduced to historical footnotes. The worn toes of a scholar's boots in a Lorenzetti fresco, the ink-stained fingers of a scribe in the Tres Riches Hures, these details whisper across centuries about calloused hands and weary eyes. They remind us that behind every glossed Aristotle or translated Quran stood someone who'd likely slept in barns, bartered for parchment, and wondered if their work would outlast the next winter. Art froze them mid-journey, forever leaning into the wind, their books and staves testaments to the unrelenting pursuit of light in an age too often painted as dark. The term Dark Ages conjures images of a Europe shrouded in ignorance, where superstition reigned and scientific progress ground to a halt. But the parchment trail tells a radically different story. Far from an intellectual blackout, the medieval period pulsed with scientific exchange, its arteries stretching from the observatories of Baghdad to the scriptoriums of Oxford. Consider the quiet revolution that unfolded when Arabic numerals infiltrated European accounting houses in the 12th century. These deceptively simple symbols 0 through 9 didn't just streamline bookkeeping. They shattered the limitations of clunky Roman numerals, enabling complex calculations that would later fuel banking, navigation, and even Copernicus' celestial math. The journey of these digits reveals the hidden highways of medieval science. Arab merchants introduced them in Sicily's markets. Jewish scholars translated Persian mathematical texts in Toledo, and finally, a young Leonardo Fibonacci encountered them in Bugia, North Africa, before compiling his groundbreaking Liber Abaci in 1202. What began as an accounting tool in Hindu temples became the universal language of modern mathematics, all because medieval scholars refused to let borders dictate the movement of ideas. Astronomy offers an even more dramatic case of cross-continental collaboration. The Zij al-Sindhind, an 8th century astronomical handbook from Baghdad, didn't just gather dust in caliphs' libraries, it embarked on an epic odyssey. Muslim astronomers refined Ptolemy's star charts with observations from Damascus' Great Quadrant. Then Jewish translators in Catalonia rendered the text into Latin for Archbishop Raymond of Toledo. By the time English scholar Daniel of Morley brought a copy to Oxford in the 12th century, its tables had been annotated in 3 languages, adjusting planetary motions based on observations from Cordoba to Constantinople. This wasn't passive copying, it was crowdsourcing on parchment, with each culture adding new data like layers on a palimpsest. The result, a 13th century Oxford manuscript correcting Aristotle's cosmology with evidence that shooting stars weren't atmospheric phenomena, as the Greek philosopher claimed, but celestial bodies burning up in descent, a conclusion reached by comparing Arabic, Greek, and original observations. Medicine too traveled these knowledge routes. The Canon of Medicine by Persian polymath Ibn Sina Avicenna became Europe's medical Bible not through conquest but through translation. In Salerno's bustling clinics, Constantine the African rendered its diagnostic methods into Latin, while in Montpellier, Jewish physicians cross-referenced its treatments with local herbs. A striking example survives in a 15th century Florentine manuscript. Next to Ibn Sina's recipe for a headache salve, an Italian scribe scribbled, works better with Tuscan lavender than Eastern nard. This marginal note captures medieval science's essence: global frameworks adapted through local experimentation. The real myth isn't medieval ignorance, but our modern assumption that connectivity began with the internet. When a Benedictine monk in Normandy tracked a comet's path in 1066 using an Arabic star chart, or when the Viennese astronomer Georg von Feuerbach based his lunar theories on Hebrew translations of Persian texts in 1450, they participated in a web of knowledge stretching across faiths and kingdoms. The so-called Dark Ages glimmered with collaborative light. If we know where to look, the evidence lingers in cathedral clocks powered by gear mechanisms from Damascus, in Venetian navigational charts annotated with Arab portolan symbols, even in the recipe for spectacles invented in Pisa using glass-making techniques from Islamic Spain. These weren't isolated flashes of brilliance, but nodes in a vast, vibrating network, one that proves intellectual curiosity has always been borderless. By the 16th century, the roads that had once carried scholars freely between Paris and Padua, Oxford and Krakow, began bristling with new dangers: not just bandits and bad weather, but border guards demanding loyalty oaths and inquisitors sniffing out heresy. The Protestant Reformation shattered Christendom's fragile unity, turning what had been academic debates into life or death divides. A German student traveling to Italy in 1520 might be interrogated about his views on transubstantiation before crossing the Alps. A French humanist visiting Spain could find himself detained for possessing Erasmus's heretical writings. The very Latin that had been a lingua franca now carried accents of suspicion. A phrase like sola scriptura, scripture alone, could mark you as Lutheran in Catholic lands or a papal loyalist in Protestant ones. The age of the wandering scholar, that centuries-old tradition of footloose intellectuals, was colliding with the rise of something far less forgiving: the nation-state. Universities, once proudly cosmopolitan, began turning inward, where medieval students had organized themselves by nations based on geographic origin, the Normans studying alongside the Picards in Paris, the Poles beside the Hungarians in Prague. Now territorial rulers demanded institutional loyalty. In 1535, England's Henry Roman VIII severed ties between Oxford and the Vatican, requiring professors to swear allegiance to the crown. The University of Leiden, founded in 1575 as a bastion of Dutch Calvinism, barred Catholic scholars from its halls. Even the famed University of Bologna, which had hosted Dante and Copernicus, now enforced religious tests for faculty. The message was clear: knowledge had borders, and crossing them came at a price. The shift from itinerant scholars to resident professors wasn't just political, it was economic. Printing presses had made books cheaper and more uniform, reducing the need to travel in search of rare manuscripts. Why brave the war-torn roads to Heidelberg when a Basel printer could ship you Aristotle's complete works? Royal patrons, too, preferred to keep their intellectuals close. The Medici in Florence, the Habsburgs in Vienna, and the Tudors in London established permanent chairs for philosophers and scientists, tying prestige to place. A scholar like Tycho Brahe, who once might have roamed from court to court, now built his Uraniborg Observatory on a Danish island, funded by King Frederick Roman II for life provided he stayed put. Yet the spirit of the wandering scholar refused to die. It resurfaced in figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam, who famously declared himself a citizen of the world, even as he dodged accusations of heresy from both Catholics and reformers. His letters, crisscrossing Europe in saddlebags and merchant ships, became a digital age-like network of ideas before the digital age. Or consider the physician Paracelsus, who deliberately modeled himself on the medieval peripatetic scholars, traveling from Germany to Constantinople to study alchemy. then deliberately burning his lecture notes in Basel to force students to think for themselves. These Renaissance humanists might not have slept in roadside barns like their predecessors, but they kept the old flame alive. The belief that truth couldn't be monopolized by any single institution or ideology. The most poignant legacy of the wandering scholars, though, lies in the books they left behind. Open a 16th century edition of Plotho printed in Venice, and you might find marginalia in 4 languages: Greek from the editor, Latin from a German scholar, Italian from a local student, and perhaps even Arabic numerals in the calculations. These annotated pages are silent witnesses to a world in transition, where the free flow of ideas was being both constrained by new borders and accelerated by new technologies. The scholars themselves might have hung up their traveling staffs, but their restless curiosity had already seeped into the foundations of modern science, diplomacy, and even the internet, proof that some journeys don't end when the road does. Centuries after medieval scholars trudged across continents with satchels of parchment, a new breed of knowledge seekers has emerged: digital nomads tapping away on laptops in Bali cafes or co-working spaces in Lisbon. The parallels are striking. Where Gerbert of Aurillac once ventured from France to Spain for Arabic numerals, today's remote workers cross borders for cheaper living and faster Wi-Fi, their manuscripts stored in cloud drives instead of leather satchels. The medieval scriptorium has been replaced by GitHub repositories, where coders from Lagos to Jakarta collaborate on open-source projects as seamlessly as monks once copied texts across monasteries. Even the old Latin lingua franca finds its echo in English's dominance online, enabling a South Korean developer to debug a Brazilian colleague's code without sharing a time zone. But this isn't just about geography. The open access movement mirrors the medieval struggle to democratize learning. When Elsevier charges universities exorbitant fees for journal subscriptions, it's not so different from the church controlling access to scripture before the printing press. Initiatives like Sci-Hub, the shadow library providing free academic papers, channel the same rebellious spirit as scholars who smuggled banned texts under their cloaks. The difference: where Peter Abelard risked excommunication for questioning dogma, modern researchers face paywalls and algorithmic suppression. Yet both eras share a core belief: knowledge grows when it circulates freely. International research collaborations reveal even deeper connections. Projects like CERN Large Hadron Collider, uniting physicists from over 100 countries, function like medieval Toledo's translation workshops, melding perspectives to crack cosmic mysteries. The Arxiv preprint server, where scientists share unfiltered findings, operates much like the Florentine book fairs where scholars traded raw ideas before formal publication. Even the challenges feel familiar. Just as Islamic and Christian scholars debated Aristotle's legacy, modern teams grapple with cultural biases in AI training data or climate models. The tools have changed, but the essential work of stitching together global knowledge remains. Yet technology's role is double-edged. Video calls can't replicate the accidental breakthroughs born in Bologna's taverns, where wine-lubricated debates sparked legal revolutions. A digital nomad's blog post might reach millions instantly, but does it carry the weight of a manuscript painstakingly copied by candlelight? There's a haunting question here. Have we traded depth for speed, serendipity for scalability? The medieval scholar's slow, tactile engagement with texts annotating margins, repairing parchment, cultivated a meditative rigor that today's notification-bombarded brains rarely experience. Perhaps the most profound parallel lies in the tension between centralization and dispersal. Medieval universities standardized curricula, but also birthed fierce dissent. Today's MOOC massive open online courses democratize education yet risk homogenizing thought. When a Kenyan farmer accesses agronomy lectures from Cornell, it echoes Constantine the African bringing Arabic medicine to Salerno, but who controls the platform algorithms that shape what he learns. The battleground has shifted from physical borders to digital architectures, yet the stakes who gets to know and who decides remain unchanged. This isn't just history repeating itself, it's history spiraling forward. The wandering scholar's legacy lives on in every researcher Skyping into a Berlin lab from Buenos Aires, in every activist torrenting censored textbooks into Tehran, even in every Reddit thread where strangers dissect quantum physics over memes. Their world reminds us that knowledge has always been nomadic, it's just the roads that keep changing. The image of the wandering scholar as a selfless seeker of truth, cloaked in humility and driven solely by intellectual purity, is a romantic myth that crumbles under historical scrutiny. For every Alcuin of York nobly serving Charlemagne's educational reforms, there was a Peter of Blois scheming to undermine rivals at court. These were not saints of scholarship but fiercely competitive individuals, as prone to pettiness, jealousy, and self-promotion as any modern academic. The 12th century battle between nominalists and realists, a philosophical war over whether abstract concepts had real existence, wasn't some genteel salon debate. It spilled into street brawls in Paris with supporters of Abelard, the nominalist, and Bernard of Clairvaux, the realist, hurling insults and occasionally stones across the Seine. Manuscripts from the period reveal margins filled with vicious personal attacks, one monk scribbling beside a rival's argument. This isn't logic, it's the braying of an ass. Plagiarism ran rampant in an era before copyright. The prolific encyclopedist Vincent of Beauvais was nicknamed the Great Compiler, not as praise but as critique. His Speculum Maius lifted entire passages from over 200 authors without attribution. Even revered figures like Thomas Aquinas faced accusations of borrowing heavily from Jewish and Islamic thinkers while downplaying their contributions. A particularly brazen case involved the 14th century scholar Walter Burley, who copied his own mentor's commentary on Aristotle word for word, then had the gall to dedicate it to a wealthy patron as original work. These weren't isolated incidents but standard practice in a world where manuscripts circulated without title pages or indices, making intellectual theft dangerously easy. The darker side extended to outright sabotage. When the brilliant Heloise's letters to Abelard were published, critics inserted forged passages to make her seem more submissive, twisting her feminist leanings into orthodox piety. In Toledo's translation workshops, Jewish and Christian scholars sometimes deliberately mistranslated Arabic texts to suppress ideas threatening to their faith. A 13th century Hebrew rendering of Averroes' works quietly omitted his arguments about the eternity of the world. Even the famed University of Bologna's law faculty wasn't immune. Professors were known to hoard key manuscripts, forcing students to rely on flawed copies that reinforced the teacher's preferred interpretations. Yet this messy reality makes their achievements more human, not less impressive. The same competitive drive that fueled rivalries also pushed scholars to refine their arguments. Abelard's Sic et Non, a compilation of contradictory church authorities, wasn't just provocation. It forced theologians to develop more rigorous methods of reconciliation. The plagiarism epidemic spurred new standards of citation, with figures like Albertus Magnus meticulously naming sources in their margins. Even the translation errors sometimes bore fruit. When Gerard of Cremona mistranslated an Arabic term for air pressure as spirit, it accidentally birthed a whole new line of pneumatic experiments among European alchemists. The myth of the noble scholar persists because we crave intellectual heroes, but history offers something better: flawed, brilliant people who advanced knowledge despite, and sometimes because of their very human failings. Their world wasn't a golden age of pure inquiry, but a vibrant, contentious marketplace of ideas where truth emerged not from saintly seekers, but from the clash of ambition, ego, and occasional deceit. That's a legacy far more relatable and far more interesting than any polished legend. The medieval wandering scholars left us more than just crumbling manuscripts and forgotten debates. They etched a blueprint for navigating our own age of information overload and polarized discourse. Their greatest lesson: that knowledge thrives at the crossroads, not in fortresses. When Gerbert of Aurillac brought Arabic numerals to Europe, or Jewish translators in Toledo blended Greek, Arabic, and Latin thought, they proved innovation isn't about choosing between traditions, but weaving them together. Today, as algorithms trap us in echo chambers, their example screams across the centuries: intellectual isolation isn't just limiting, it's lethal. The monasteries that hoarded books stagnated, those that traded them flourished. Resilience, too, takes on new meaning in their story. Consider the physical cost of learning in an era when acquiring a single book might mean walking 300 miles with a sack of precious parchment on your back. A scholar's all-nighter wasn't just fatigue, it was fingers numb from copying texts in freezing scriptoriums, eyes straining by flickering candlelight. Yet they persisted, not for grades or tenure, but because they believed ideas were worth chilblains and starvation. In our world of instant search results and distracted scrolling, their stubborn dedication challenges us. What knowledge would we still pursue if it demanded real sacrifice? The dangers they faced: censorship, dogma, the lure of intellectual complacency still shadow modern learning. When Peter Abelard's books were burned for challenging orthodoxy, it wasn't just medieval intolerance at work. It was the timeless fear of ideas that unsettled power. Today, book bans and platform deplatforming play out the same drama with different props. Even the medieval manuscript trade's inequalities persist. Then, it was peasants barred from Latin texts. Now, paywalls locking research behind $100 fees. The players change, but the game remains: knowledge controlled is power maintained. Yet their most surprising legacy might be the art of intellectual nomadism itself. These scholars didn't just move between places, they navigated mental frontiers, comfortable in the uncomfortable space between certainty and doubt. A Benedictine monk studying Aristotle, a Jewish physician citing the Quran in a Christian court. They modeled cognitive flexibility long before it became a buzzword. In an age where we're pressured to pick a side, their willingness to dwell in ambiguity feels revolutionary. The next time you encounter an idea that unsettles your worldview, ask yourself, what would the wandering scholars do? They'd likely unpack their satchel, invite it to converse, and keep walking. Centuries before the term globalization entered our vocabulary, the wandering scholars of medieval Europe were already weaving the threads of a connected world. Their dusty footprints across mountain passes and river fords traced the first blueprints of an intellectual network that would outlast empires and reshape civilizations. These weren't just individuals chasing knowledge, they were the living infrastructure of progress, turning isolated monasteries and fledgling universities into nodes in a sprawling web of ideas. When a Benedictine monk from Cluny carried a rare copy of Plato to a cathedral school in Chartres, or when a Jewish translator in Toledo rendered Arabic medical texts into Latin, they weren't merely moving information. They were performing alchemy, transforming the raw materials of thought into something that could bridge languages, faiths, and centuries. The echoes of their work surround us today in ways we rarely notice. Modern universities, with their international student bodies and collaborative research, are direct descendants of the medieval nations system that grouped scholars by origin in Bologna and Paris. The open access movement fighting paywalls mirrors their struggle to democratize learning beyond the Latin literate elite. Even our digital age, with its borderless data flows, carries the DNA of their relentless belief that ideas shouldn't be caged by geography. The difference: where we have fiber optic cables, they had calloused feet and an unshakable conviction that knowledge grew richer when it traveled. Yet their true legacy isn't just institutional, it's profoundly human. In an era when identity was rooted in village and vocation, these thinkers dared to define themselves by curiosity rather than birthplace. A scholar from Scotland could debate metaphysics in Salerno. A Persian astronomer's calculations might fuel a Flemish monk's sermon, and a single manuscript could stitch together the insights of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian minds. Their world rejected the notion that truth belonged to any one culture, anticipating our modern understanding that breakthroughs happen at the intersections. So the next time you download an ebook, join a global webinar, or even watch a video like this one, pause to consider the invisible lineage behind that privilege. Every click that bridges languages or time zones owes a debt to those medieval travelers who proved that knowledge, like water, finds its way across barriers. Their stories challenge us to ask, what are we carrying forward? In an age of instant access, do we still value ideas enough to wrestle with them as they did, to annotate, debate, and sometimes risk everything to share them? The wandering scholars remind us that progress isn't inevitable, it's built by individuals willing to walk uncomfortable roads. They left no grand monuments, just marginal notes in battered manuscripts, and the quiet revolution of minds changed one conversation at a time. That's their invitation to us, to be modern-day wayfarers, treating every book, every screen, every classroom as a crossroads where the past and future can meet. The roads have changed, but the journey continues. History's margins are crammed with tales too wild for textbooks, like the scholar who allegedly hollowed out a loaf of bread to smuggle Aristotle's forbidden works past suspicious border guards. Or consider the case of the 11th century monk Hermann of Reichenau, a polymath so physically disabled he couldn't turn pages alone, yet who composed groundbreaking treatises on astronomy, music, and mathematics by dictating to scribes from his bed. Then there's the baffling mystery of the Voynich manuscript, a 15th century cipher-filled book bursting with unidentifiable plants and naked nymphs floating through surreal plumbing, created by an unknown author who may have been a rogue alchemist, a delirious genius, or both. Some stories blur the line between dedication and madness. Take Richard of Wallingford, the 14th century abbot who designed an elaborate astronomical clock for St. Albans Abbey while slowly dying from leprosy. His creation not only predicted eclipses but modeled the ocean tides, its gears grinding out celestial mechanics even as his body decayed. Or the eccentric physician Arnold of Villanova, who allegedly kept a pet parrot trained to squawk, "Gaelic dogma is nonsense," at conservative colleagues during medical debates in Montpellier. The darkest gems reveal scholars bending rules to breaking point. A recently discovered palimpsest in a Vatican archive shows a 9th century scribe scraping away a pagan Greek text to copy a Christian sermon, only for modern imaging to reveal the original underneath was a lost play by Sophocles, saved by the very act meant to erase it. Elsewhere, a merchant's ledger from Bruges casually mentions purchasing 3 barrels of salted herring and 1 heretical cosmology treatise, as if forbidden knowledge was just another commodity. Now it's your turn. What's the wildest medieval scholar story you've stumbled upon? A Catalan alchemist's recipe for dragon summoning buried in a cookbook? The Icelandic monk who carved runes into his bedpost complaining about snoring roommates. Drop your favorites in the comments. Let's crowdsource history's most gloriously odd footnotes together. After all, the wandering scholars would have loved nothing more than a good, unruly debate, preferably over ale, with extra bread for smuggling.